Bonjour à tous. Donc nos derniers panélistes nous rejoignent et nous allons démarrer dès à présent. Nous allons avoir une dernière panéliste qui va arriver, qui était dans les transports. Merci beaucoup. Merci à tous, bienvenue. Et tout d'abord, je voulais féliciter l'organisation et remercier les MEDays, l'Institut Amadeus et mon ami Brahim pour cette invitation et pour nous rassembler ici pour parler de l'innovation en Afrique, de la tech africaine. Et c'est un vrai plaisir et bonheur pour moi d'être parmi vous pour modérer ce panel pour parler de disruption, d'innovation, de rupture à l'ère du digital, notamment dans la fintech et les infrastructures. Et nous avons un panel de choix pour pouvoir en parler. Je me présente, je m'appelle Samir Abdelkrim, je suis auteur, entrepreneur, je suis le fondateur d'Emerging Valley. Et je vais tout de suite vous présenter nos panélistes, mais tout d'abord, pour cadrer un peu nos échanges, il est important de rappeler que l'écosystème tech africain a attiré entre 2020 et 2021 plus de 5 milliards de dollars d'investissement, selon le dernier rapport de Partech Africa. Partech Africa, dont les bureaux africains sont basés à Dakar et à Nairobi. Il s'agit du taux de croissance le plus rapide au monde, si on compare avec d'autres continents, dans le domaine de la tech. Et l'an passé, on a encore vu confirmer cette grande tendance et ce potentiel des startups africaines à attirer de nouveaux investisseurs et à faire émerger, à faire croître des licornes. Les premières licornes africaines, made in Africa, on en parle beaucoup dans la Silicon Valley. Eh bien, on en voit de plus en plus apparaître sur le continent africain. Bien sûr, on a tous en tête Wave pour le Sénégal, mais il y en a bien d'autres, et on en a compté plus de 7 l'an passé. Cependant, on compte encore de nombreux obstacles pour la consolidation de cet écosystème africain du financement, de l'émergence et la consolidation, et même, je dirais, le passage à l'échelle globale de ces licornes africaines. Et ce que l'on voit aussi, c'est bien entendu qu'une manière très disparate, une répartition, une distribution du financement qui n'est pas homogène sur l'ensemble du continent. On parle souvent de ce qu'on appelle les Big Four, le Nigeria, dont nous avons des représentants sur ce panel, le Kenya, historiquement, l'Afrique du Sud pour les infrastructures et pour le financement, et de plus en plus l'Égypte, notamment pour le mass market. Mais on voit que ce sont souvent ces 4 pays qui tirent vers le haut les financements, et l'Afrique francophone reste quand même, et le reste du continent africain, de l'ouest, du nord et du centre, reste quand même en arrière de la main par rapport à ces pays, ces Big Four anglophones. Et la question, c'est comment on peut harmoniser davantage ce financement et comment aussi on peut encourager la montée en puissance de pays qui commencent à tirer leur épingle du jeu, par exemple au Sénégal. On voit aussi des choses très intéressantes se faire au Maroc et au Ghana aussi, pour l'Afrique anglophone. Et pour répondre à ces questions et essayer d'apporter des réponses et débattre ensemble, j'ai la chance d'avoir avec moi un panel vraiment de première qualité avec Madame Sholape Akinpelu, la CEO d'Airvest, qui nous vient du Nigeria et que je vous demande d'applaudir. Mrs. Irene Oshem, you're the founder of the African Women Innovation and Entrepreneurship Forum based in Cape Town, South Africa. Je vous demande d'applaudir Irene. Notre ami Richard Séché, qui vient d'Abidjan, qui est le fondateur de l'association 3535 francophone et qui est aussi entrepreneur et travaille aussi dans l'investissement. Et je vous demande de l'applaudir. Il va nous partager ses insights. Nous avons également avec nous Philippe Ndoukaya, qui vient du Tchad, du Cameroun, qui vient du Cameroun, de Douala, je crois, voilà, de la région littorale, et qui est le CEO de Phil John Tech. Je vous demande de l'applaudir. Nous avons, we have the chance to have with us Mrs. Eva Gudminska. She's the CEO of Humans in the Loop, and she's coming straight from Bulgaria, from Sofia. And she will share with us her experience. And je vous demande d'applaudir chaleureusement Eva. Et enfin, mais elle n'est pas encore arrivée, nous allons accueillir dans quelques minutes, je l'espère, Mrs. Ethel Koffier, the CEO of Edel Technology Consulting from Ghana. Et je vous demande de l'applaudir quand même, mais elle va arriver bientôt. Alors, ma première question s'adressait à toi, mon cher Richard. Aujourd'hui, quand on parle de la FinTech et de la scène FinTech africaine, peux-tu, en 5 minutes, nous poser le décor de le state of the art de la FinTech en Afrique aujourd'hui, qui sont les players et comment, depuis ces 5 dernières années, on a vu une transformation de l'écosystème entrepreneurial africain, précisément grâce au FinTech. And by the way, you have the simultaneous translation, if you need to. And I will ask the question for you in English.
So, thank you, Sami. So thank you for having me also. Hello. Yes. So thank you, Sami. Thank you for having me. So I think when you look back at the African startup ecosystem for the last 10 years, you've seen that we've made headway. So traditionally, when you have different participants and startup participants that actually are looking sector-wise, you're seeing that fintech is playing a key role. So for example, you had, of course, we're speaking of the big 4 countries. We all know them: South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, and you have Egypt also that's rising. You had initially in Nigeria, for example, you had what we call ecosystem builders. So ecosystem builders technically are going to say, hey, we love entrepreneurship, we love startups, but we're realizing that we do not necessarily have an enabling environment. Those startups lack infrastructure, lack access to finance, lack different, features and incentives that make an ecosystem to be able to prosper. So in the case of Nigeria, for example, you have pioneers such as CC Herb, for example, which actually led the way in terms of improving the environment. You realized very early on that international fintechs or payments or big financial institutions, for example, would not easily allow all sorts of financial transactions happening within Africa. So I remember back in the days, for example, when you look at PayPal, for example, you didn't have the ability for merchants based in Nigeria to be able to actually accept payments from abroad. So you had those kinds of roadblocks, and you then had local entrepreneurs, so young, startups, who said, let's kind of fix it. So you had, for example, the emerging stories of Flutterwave, of Paystack, that actually came into the picture and provided real-world solutions so that merchants and other actors could actually use a number of transactions, could actually make a number of financial transactions. So you have a layer. Traditionally, when you look at startups, you have the financial layer, which is essential because it kind of unlocks the whole ecosystem. So whenever you go in Nigeria or in Egypt or elsewhere, you're seeing fintech being a sector of choice, a sector where you have investors that are willing to pour money. You're having now beyond payments companies, you have now different other companies. So you have companies that, for example, are looking at providing open API so that they're requesting banks, for example, to be able to open their platforms so that you can have different financial transactions going on. You have fintech companies that are providing salary advance payments. You have fintech companies that are actually leading buy now pay later. So you have the whole ecosystem of companies that's emerging. And I think one of the key stats that I love to traditionally use, if you look at Nigeria, you have the oldest bank in Nigeria, which is called First National Bank. For example, I think that dates back over a century ago. But when you look today at the valuation of a startup like Flutterwave, that just has 8 years of existence. So you have an institution that predates a century, and then you have a company that has only 8 years of existence that came in, the valuation today of Flutterwave is higher than the valuation of First National Bank. So that tells you a lot about the potential of fintech in our region.
Merci beaucoup, Richard. On peut l'applaudir pour cette présentation. I will ask you a question based on what you just said to you, Irene. What do you have to say about the encouraging fundraising figures that we have seen so far in 2022? Do you think that now it's really time to invest in African startups, especially in fintech, because of the potential of inclusivity it could trigger for the societies? Yeah. The mic, you have to push one button.
Okay, yes, okay. Thank you for the question, and thank you, Amadeus Institute, for bringing us back together after almost 3 years. Yeah, as Richard, just said now, we are seeing a big wave of investment and players, untraditional players in the financial sector. And he has just mentioned the Nigeria Paystack and Flutterwave, but not only, we have them elsewhere. So generally, what we are seeing in the ecosystem is this wave of African tech startups, and a lot of money coming into Africa for the first time since 2015. It has been more than 18 times increase in tech, tech investment into the continent. And in the last, between 2020 and 2021, I would say 2 times more than the global rate of investment. But it's not only in the financial sector, and it shouldn't be only for the financial sector. Clean tech is important, and I think clean tech is actually, if the pace continues, will overcome financial sector, because we have an example of Sun King that recently raised $260 million US, and I think that's more than Flutterwave raised this year. So clean tech is important. Education, we have seen, is critical. With COVID, we saw what happened. We had to take education to technology. So EdTech is very, very important, it's critical. It's not yet, attracting investment as for the financial sector and the clean energy sector, but that needs to happen. And I would say also health, the health sector. This is another sector that with COVID, we have seen how critical, how important it is that we leverage technology to solve, to create solutions, African solutions that will, target African problems, and solutions that can also drive, get to people in the rural communities, because that is where we have more need for interventions. And then that brings me also to agriculture. Okay, you have agri-tech. Africa is going through food security is so important now, and with climate action taking, which is important now, just as every other sustainable development goes, but more critical in that sector. So it's important to use technology in the agricultural sector to drive African agriculture, because that is what Africa needs to develop, not energy, not any of those things. We need food. And that will bring me also to something that I would like to mention before I can hand over to you. We are talking about all these tech investments and tech startups, but we see a marginalization when it comes to women. Okay, so the investment that we are seeing coming into this tech sector is not reaching to women. The percentage of investment getting to women-led and women-owned tech startups is so very minor, so it's less than 2%. And that is something that we need to look into, how to drive inclusive investment and inclusive support that will include women. Thank you.
Thank you. On peut applaudir Irène pour son intervention. Merci beaucoup, Irène. Sholape, we will talk about women further and more deeper a little bit later, but because you're based in Nigeria, and as just mentioned, and also by Richard, Nigeria is really at the epicenter of the African fintech ecosystem. You mentioned some of the big companies. According to you, from your point of view from Nigeria, how have you seen the progression of the fintech sector in the world economy, and how is it driving and pushing forward the ecosystem of the African tech, the continent, the world continent tech ecosystem?
All right, thank you so much. Firstly, I would like to say that as Africans, we are solutionists, and that is because almost everywhere you turn, there are challenges. It's either power, infrastructures, healthcare, education. Something is broken somewhere. And I think that has significantly enabled the growth we've seen in technology on the continent, and of course in context, fintech here. I would say that for Nigeria, as you'd asked, first, a lot of Nigerian founders have treated innovation not as a big bang, as a lot of people would think when you say, oh, so you have to be innovative. But what they've done is to rearrange solutions and scale such with tech. A lot of growth has been seen, especially in the payment in Nigerian fintech, and that has enabled a lot of remittances, that's fixed a lot of gaps in remittances in payments within Nigeria and inter-country. I think that a remarkable one was the Paystack acquisition too. It's certainly redefined the tech ecosystem, the tech space, because for a long time we saw that there could be a successful acquisition of an indigenously grown fintech startup. Yes, why that comes with its pros and cons, of course, depending on terms agreed on. It is a clear validation that further solutions can be built. With the prevalence of challenges, with the prevalence of problems, if you look at it long and hard enough, you come up with innovative ways, to conquer such. And I think that same can be replicated across board. One of the things that had helped, I think it was Richard that mentioned before, is the incubators and accelerators. It's so much in abundance. Everywhere you look at in the corners, if you go to the main cities, even in the countryside, you see incubators, you see accelerators. It will almost be self-sabotaging not to take such opportunities. Then I'll just round up to say that, of course, we need inclusivity. We need diversity in the adoption of these solutions, because truly that's when we can build holistic solutions for Nigeria, for the continent generally.
Thank you. Je vous demande d'applaudir pour son intervention sur ce focus sur le Nigeria. I will come back to you and also to you, Erin, about the specific topic of women, because I see that this is a huge topic about inclusivity. But before going to Eva, je vais te poser une question à toi, Philippe. Est-ce que tu peux un petit peu décrire le rôle de ta structure, le portefeuille, surtout les entreprises que vous accompagnez aujourd'hui au Cameroun, et quel genre d'impact vous essayez d'avoir, et comment, de ton point de vue d'un pays d'Afrique francophone, d'un des plus grands pays d'Afrique centrale, tu as vu l'évolution de l'écosystème tech et notamment des nouvelles solutions fintech pour ouvrir de nouvelles opportunités.
D'accord, merci Samir. So I will switch in English so everyone can understand what I'm saying. Okay. We have a data analysis and cloud ERP solution in SaaS for about 5 years in Cameroon. Today we operate in more than 10 countries in Africa. We also have some bases in Kinshasa, in Brazzaville, and in Bangui. The ecosystem in Francophone Africa is quite tricky. because, you know, it's all about mindset. Because I always say that the mindset in Francophone Africa is not the same as in Anglophone Africa. I've done the both. I went to Lagos, I went to Accra, I went to Dakar, Abidjan. So I know, I saw things done differently, right? So we saw that many things have changed in Francophone Africa over the years. When I came back, because I was living abroad, so I came back in Cameroon in 2017 to launch this project, Fusion Technologies. And at that time, it was quite complicated, very, very complicated, because, you know, the key for empowering tech is education. I think that education is really the key to improve the tech sector, education at every level, not only to understand how tech can enable the countries and everything, but education even from the smaller ones to the more mature ones. Yeah, so it was important to educate first of all the stakeholders in Cameroon. To tell them that this is now, that we need to act. You need to act for the tech ecosystem. You need to put in place the ecosystem. As Richard said, in Nigeria, you have a lot of incubators, facilitators, and everything. That was the first thing that we put in place in Cameroon. Because you have a lot of startups, you have a lot of youth that have ideas. But if you have the idea, you don't have the execution, you will never go very far, because the idea is good, but execute is more important. And that's why the first thing that we put in place in Cameroon was tech incubators. You have active spaces, you have a Bukaru, you have many incubators that have been put in place in Cameroon, and that helps different startups to understand the ecosystem first, to understand in what they are going through, and to give them some education and knowledge about the different perspectives that they need to have to build a very strong and powerful company. And also, when we started in Central Africa, there were a lot of confusion. What is a startup? What is a startup? What's the difference between a startup and a SMB? And a lot of stakeholders in our country, government, everything, was mixing up everything. Because a startup is not an SMB, it's two different type of companies, right? And what we did, and we are still doing now, is to put in place a startup act in Cameroon, right? And for the past 4 years, we have been working with government to put in place a startup act. And what came true is that in 2021, they had a lot of changes as tax exoneration for the startups. Like today in Cameroon, if you open a startup, you have 5 years, you pay no tax. 5 years, you pay no tax before starting to pay the different taxes. And also, if you reach a certain threshold in your turnover or your revenue or profit, now you can start to pay taxes. So that's a lot of actions that we did with the stakeholders for them to understand that there's something going on and they need to act on it. And also, fintech in Cameroon today, it's a little bit slow, but we already have some pioneers. We Cash Up, Small Pay, and others that are trying to now gain some momentum and try to raise also some funds. I think that the highest startup that raised funds in Cameroon is about $5 million. You see, it's not as huge as in Nigeria or other countries, but it's something that is going through. And today, we as a company first, we act and put in place a lot of events also to educate the masses, but educate also stakeholders. That is important to build the future, because the future is now.
Merci. On peut applaudir Philippe. Merci beaucoup Philippe pour ton intervention. Et ta vision terrain depuis le Cameroun, hein, depuis ton activité et de l'écosystème avec qui tu travailles, que tu accompagnes. We have the chance to have Eva with us. Eva, which is an entrepreneur, and she's developing a solution for inclusivity, especially for en français, les personnes les plus précaires, comme commencer par les réfugiés. Can you describe us your company? What are you doing, and what kind of solution are you providing for using technology, using EI, using fintech for the refugee?
Yes. Here? Okay. Yes, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm really, really happy to be here. I come from Bulgaria, so I'm not based on the African continent, but I'm very proud that our solution that we developed locally in Bulgaria, we're now scaling across borders, and we're focusing on the Middle East, but also now on different African countries to see how we can provide solutions that are based on our successful experience in Bulgaria, but also adapted to local contexts and in partnerships with local partners. So essentially, as you mentioned, we work with refugees and vulnerable groups. We provide them with online jobs so that they can start to work online as freelancers, and we train them in a particular skill which is required for artificial intelligence, which is preparing the data for it. So we're giving them both training and work. And I definitely see a lot of promise in bringing people, even who do not have a lot of a very high level of skills, into digital jobs. So for us, a big inspiration, we're actually really inspired by two African-based companies. One of them is Andela, that of course you may already know of. They're one of the unicorns on the continent, and for us it's really an inspiring model of how to create a critical mass of highly skilled tech workers. We want to do the same thing, but for lower skilled workers, to bring them to, let's say, their first digital job and maybe enable them to progress further to other jobs. Another African model that we're following is that of Samasource. They're based in, I think, Kenya and Uganda. And their model is of impact sourcing. So creating jobs that are done by outsourcing to Western clients, and with a special focus on vulnerable groups, those who otherwise, in a pure business sense, would not be very attractive workers because they come from different difficult backgrounds. They do not possess all of the skills, but the motto is to trust them, to build up their skills, and to hire them, to make them hireable also for future businesses. So I would say that we, even though we're an Eastern European company, we're really inspired by successful models in different African countries. I love to explore opportunities for us to work across borders with different organizations in the Middle East, in Europe, in Africa, in order to create solutions that are viable for vulnerable people across all of these different locations. Of course, with a very with a lot of sensitivity to the local context, to intersectionality, and, for example, the problem of gender inclusion, the problem of economic inclusion, of different types of racial inclusion. So for us, it's really important to design things that are scalable and applicable to different locations, but of course that are adapted to the local context.
Merci beaucoup. On peut applaudir Riva pour sa présentation. On va passer sur peut-être une deuxième partie de ce débat. On voit que en termes de stock, les startups africaines figurent à l'échelle continentale parmi les premières au monde en nombre de levées par continent, mais restent quand même très en retard par rapport au volume des levées de fonds, les flux. Et la question se pose de comment on peut abattre les obstacles et favoriser ce passage à l'échelle. Et parmi les principaux obstacles, il y a la question aussi des barrières qui sont présentes, notamment pour l'entrepreneuriat féminin, about women entrepreneurship. And I go back to you, Irene, because I know that you're passionate about this topic. Yes, this is what you do. Women have been under spotlight with many tech supporting programs directed to women inclusion all across the continent. Where do we stand now, and what progress has been made since the last 2 years? where do we stand now in terms of women inclusion using technology, and also women entrepreneurship? So where do we stand now comparing with 2 years ago? Are we in the progress, or do we have our still behind, way behind about what we have to do to achieve our goals?
No, thank you. We are certainly making progress, and quite a good progress, but it's still not enough. If you think of 2 years ago, if you are talking like pre-COVID and since COVID, I would say that we see a lot of more women enterprises. And that is because one of the reasons is that during COVID, women were disproportionately impacted. The areas where you see a lot of women operating is usually in those service or low-level sectors or value chains. And these were also the sectors that were seriously, gravely impacted by COVID. So they suffered a lot. And what we see is resilience, a lot of it. So they are reviving, they are coming up. But pre-COVID already, we were making a lot of progress in women entrepreneurship. We have seen small progress in financial inclusion, in funding for women-owned businesses. There is no equal access to finance. So these are the things that we are working on. At my organization, the Africa Women Innovation and Entrepreneurship Forum, this is what we do. We identify those challenges that constrain women entrepreneurship and women accessing equal opportunities, economic opportunities. And they are the skills, so we build skills, we work, we have spoken a lot about acceleration and incubation programs. So at AWIF, we run acceleration programs, we run incubation programs. They could be sector-specific or stage of business focused. So to support them, to train them. Another challenge that we have identified is accessing market. And we also have programs. We design solutions that help them to access more market for their products and their services. We have the problem of finance, which is the most critical. Currently, we have a program with the African Development Bank through its affirmative finance action for women in Africa. And we are working there providing combining training with facilitating access to this initiative that the African Development Bank has for women entrepreneurs. There is also the problem of network. Okay, so because accessing network, the right networks for growth, as entrepreneurs, we all know how important it is to have a network. As they say, your network is your net worth. So we have created also a network, actually a community, a digital community for them to connect to themselves, but also to other ecosystem players. So these are the areas. So I would say that generally there has been a lot of growth, a lot of awareness. In many countries, in South Africa where I am based, in Nigeria and in so many other places, you have incentives, government incentives. Philippe spoke about the incentives that they have in Cameroon, where for the first 5 years, you don't pay tax. So many African countries, Egypt, we were just in Egypt last month for our conference, and I believe also Morocco. So there are these incentives, there is more awareness, and then there is also not only from the government as regulators putting up these incentives, but also from the private sector. I think the gender agenda is more something that even the private sectors, the corporates, they cannot do without anymore. So there is also from the private sector a strong support, for women's economic empowerment to drive women entrepreneurship because they have seen the benefits that brings. And then also from the development partners. We work a lot with USAID, I've mentioned African Development Bank, we work with GIZ, we work with so many development players. We are currently starting a project funded by the European Commission. So generally from all angles, from all stakeholders, ecosystem players, there is a much more awareness to support women as entrepreneurs. They are creating jobs, they are creating wealth, and they are helping build African economies. So why not support them?
Merci beaucoup. On peut applaudir Irène pour son intervention. Je me tourne directement vers vous. According to you, following what have just been said by Irene, what are the main obstacles for women entrepreneurs and women entrepreneurship? How we can reduce the barriers and make more, inspire more women to become entrepreneurs in Africa?
All right, thank you so much. There are myriads of challenges, but I'll start first with mindset, right? And that is, deeply entrenched in, our culture. So it's often not said, but in most cases across the continent, a woman is, just sit pretty, look great. If you're coupled up, you should be taken care of. And so for long, that has really gone into our conscious. So it's not, it's like you say, it's a bias. It's an unconscious bias, actually. But then there is a growing awakening, and we realize that we are underwhelming the economic opportunities of the continent by having about half of it, waiting for handouts, right? So it's no longer it's a gender agenda, but it's an economic imperative if you look at it and you zone in. And so with a lot of awakening, with a lot of literacy levels rising, that is broad education and financial literacy, because that is key. So you realize that education alone at broad levels is not sufficient. You could be a doctor, you could be a professor, and then be financially literate. And then what happens is that whatever funds you get, you're just conduiting. You're not saving, you're not preserving, you're not passing it on to the next generation, which is another one. So we have, with higher levels of education, changes in mindsets, and financial literacy, there's this adoption by women, not just to participate much in entrepreneurship, but to scale. Because if you look at the face, for instance, I think there are more female SME owners, more than male, on the continent. But that is how there's a gap, because by the time you look at how hard they are working, by the time you look at the sizes of what they turn over and how they are scaling those solutions, it is entirely different. And like we said, there's a difference between an SME, and a startup. So what happens to all these mindsets? So there's an awakening, and that's what my organization, which is for inclusive finance for African women, that's what we do, because we realize that there are more you can change when there is a change in your mindset, than capital itself. And that brings me to the second point. Capital has been a huge barrier. And when I initially started looking at capital being a barrier, it felt like, maybe women are not pushing hard enough. Maybe, until as a founder myself, Harvest started about 2 years ago, and I'd spoken to nothing less than 80 investors, and we have less than 5 on our cap table, right? And it's still unfolding. It's an ongoing conversation. The reality, if we'll be honest, the reality is not far from what you see with men. But the truth is that while men are spoken to about 80, they've raised maybe 4 times how much we have raised as an organization. And it got me probing for that, to say, what are the challenges here? Is the business not fundable enough? And it took me back to what I really discovered, and we spoke about during IWD this year, to say that half of the world population is women. That is established. But then when we start looking at the billionaires, we have over 81%, I think, being male. So if implicit bias is something to go by, people generally would relate with people who look like them, who think like them. There's the boys club, factor there. So if the fund is coming from about 80-something%, and if both male and female, let's even say that in terms of the entrepreneurs, they are outnumbered. By the time a male founder who cuts the check has spoken to 10, and then there are 2 women, chances, if you look at numbers, chances are that the male will get funded than. And so when you look at it, what we are bridging for, that is inclusive finance, it is not something that we can easily see its gains in 100 years. Because we just have to now start working on women's psyche, such that we have more women that can cut the check in another 50 years. And then when our daughters, when our nieces, when they start their own businesses, there are more women up there who can actually cut them that check. But then it's an ongoing conversation.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup. We are not finished about this topic. We will come back later because, and hopefully Ethel will join you. I'm checking if she's coming. Let's go back about the ecosystem and funding level with you, Richard. Tu as entendu les interventions précédentes à propos du fait que une des raisons pour lesquelles le niveau des levées, c'est aussi parce qu'on ne prend pas suffisamment au sérieux les femmes entrepreneurs. De ton point de vue, alors je sais aussi, je vais le citer, c'est qu'en Côte d'Ivoire, et tu es impliqué, il y a des acteurs, on a parlé du Startup Act, il y a des acteurs qui se mobilisent pour sensibiliser le gouvernement, le CI20 en Côte d'Ivoire par exemple, que tu connais très bien. Selon toi, quel genre d'acteurs publics devraient être mobilisés pour contribuer à réduire ce gap et à encourager, par exemple, des législations pour qu'il y ait plus de femmes entrepreneurs et surtout pour faire exploser un peu ce plafond de verre qui fait que les femmes entrepreneurs n'arrivent pas à lever suffisamment de fonds. Et c'est peut-être aussi ce qui explique le petit niveau des startups par rapport à d'autres continents.
Thank you, Sami. I think one statistic, I would say something we can shed light on, for example. Let's look, for example, at India. You have India, you have Africa. Roughly the same population, 1.3 billion around. But you have India, which is a country. You have Africa, which is 54 or 55 countries. But India is punching above its weight. India is able to, as a startup, nation or as a country which actually is host to startups, is able to raise up to 11 times more funding compared to Africa, whenever we have the same geographical realities. So I think that when we have these kind of conversations among within African countries, what you realize is that there's a problem of finance, obviously, for entrepreneurs, for startups. Of course, also women entrepreneurs are also affected. There's been a lot of conversation when we're building the startup about who really matters as the participants. Initially, we looked at the entrepreneurs themselves. People were saying the entrepreneurs are not well prepared. The entrepreneurs, do not have good ideas. Either they don't know how to execute. There's not maybe proper product market fit. Some of the solutions they have is not really grounded into addressing real problems. So much of the initial work was about how can we nurture better entrepreneurs, so to make sure that we had talent and quality entrepreneurs who are able to actually have mission critical ideas and solutions that actually answer to the realities of our current economies. And then we looked at it and we said, the entrepreneurs, they thrive in an ecosystem. So what can we do? So you had that huge explosion of incubators, accelerators, startup building companies, entrepreneur support organizations, a whole lot. So they are providing value at diverse levels, according to their competency and what they do. And then we looked at that also, we said, okay, that's fine. Are there other actors that we can involve? A lot of entrepreneurs sometimes tend to think within their bubble, and they don't realize that there are some powerful actors that actually can really help us, the startup ecosystem and the environment to actually thrive. And you mentioned, for example, government, what they can do. We're looking, for example, obviously at Startup Act, which started, we had the Startup Act that was, the first that was enacted, if I'm correct, was in Rwanda, for example. My country, Cote d'Ivoire, is currently working around a Startup Act that has yet to be adopted. But I think that governments are really, I would say, a stakeholder that can do much more, than, providing maybe financial incentives. I want to take two concrete examples. For example, people are saying, why don't we have a large market, and have large market, African market? You have regional institutions, and those regional institutions, I think, critically can play a big role, for example, in terms of supporting entrepreneurs. How do they do that? Is by making sure that the fragmented nature of our 54 countries tend to be perceived or to become a single large market and a single economy. So obviously you have AFCFTA, which is ongoing. But from a startup perspective, what does it mean? I, Richard, am an entrepreneur. I want to launch a fintech startup in Zambia. I want to expand my operations in Morocco. I'm going to have to deal with 54 different authorities, for example. But when you look, for example, at the regional institutions, what you're going to see is that, for example, in West Africa, you have the West African Economic Monetary Union. In West Africa, you have only one license, so you can apply for what we call a super license. And this super license allows you, for example, to be able to operate and roll out banking operations into the 8 countries. Why don't we take these best practices that are currently happening and scale it up throughout Africa, for example? We all know about the problems of visa-free countries. I mean, 54 countries, you still have to figure out your way around in terms of moving around. So I think regional institutions can play can be a powerful lever in terms of actually making sure that we have a thriving environment process. The other, I think, questions also where governments can really be useful are actually trying to mobilize local investment. We've seen that most of the funding that flows into startups today represent foreign capital. Okay, but on the other hand, you've had now institutions that are be able to collect, funding. I'm speaking of pension funds. I'm speaking of institutions, social security companies. In Morocco, you have CDG, for example. I think we had a very interesting program for startup that was called CDG 212. Of course, they have fiduciary responsibility, but we can look at mechanisms where they can actually, structure programs or interventions that actually help, to have serious capital that actually can be flown into our best entrepreneurs and raise them to become national champions. If we're able to do that, I think we can have, 54 flutways in every African country.
Merci beaucoup, Richard. On peut l'applaudir pour son intervention. Je te redonne tout de suite la parole sur les Startup Acts. Aujourd'hui, tu nous as dit qu'il y a une réflexion, il y a un travail qui s'est engagé au Cameroun sur les Startup Acts. Est-ce que, selon toi, les Startup Acts peuvent et devraient être une des solutions pour justement augmenter les niveaux d'investissement, rassurer les investisseurs et donner ce cadre qui permet de rassurer et aussi de répondre au problème qui était soulevé juste avant par rapport au rôle des femmes, qui reste trop sous-évalué dans l'écosystème?
Okay. So I would just say that the Startup Act is just a small part of the solution because it's an act, right? The act needs to be adopted and need to be efficient. The act gives or enables startup in the specific country to know how they can evolve, right? So I took an example about the 5-year exoneration taxes in Cameroon for the startups, and you have many other incentives that are coming through the Startup Act. So the Startup Act is important because it helps the government, but also the stakeholders and the startups to understand what is the startup and how you can deal with it. So yeah, it gives a how can I say it, an ecosystem, a way to move and to be perceived also for the foreign investors or even the local investor to know how we can deal with startups. It's important, yes, because you know, you have a lot of investors in Cameroon, banks, microfinance, even angel investors. But since the notion of the startup is not well understood, it's difficult to them to comprehend exactly how they can deal with startups. I will take an example in Cameroon. For the past 4 years, we did a lot of crowd equity funding in Cameroon. Like we had like more than 5 or 6 startups that did crowd equity in Cameroon. And at that time, it was perceived as an IPO. For the government was perceiving it as an IPO, but it's not an IPO, right? It's different. But the Startup Act enables for the government, the stakeholder, to say, okay, when a startup have some funding, this is the different types of funding that a startup can have, and this is how we can treat it into our different customs. So yes, it's important, but I think it's just a part of the solution. I say again that education is, I think, is the key. Is really the key for us to evolve. Education for women, education for every stakeholders to know what is important and what we need to prioritize for us to move forward. So for the women entrepreneurship, from my perspective, right? In Fusion Technologies, in our company, we have 40% of our staff are women, and even in the executive committee, 2 on 5 board members are women. So for us, it's very important to have different perspective. It's very important to know, to give the place of the woman in entrepreneurship, and also not only in the entrepreneurship ecosystem, but also in the chain of decision. That is very, very important. But because sometimes in government, they will say, okay, we did many incentives, we did many actions toward the women entrepreneurship, but they're not giving the power. They say, okay, maybe if you have 100,000 SMB or startups owned by women, they will say, okay, we shall give maybe a grant, or we have some felicitation about that, but they're not giving the power. Say, okay, in our committee, in our board chair members and everything, we should have maybe 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 women on the 10 seats that we can have. And I think that is a very important discussion that we need to have, and we men need to do better on that side. So I understand perfectly the different engagement that we need to have on those questions, and I think education is very important in what we do. I will just take another example. So we are based in Cameroon, right? But the first grant that we received as a startup in Cameroon was from Tony Elumelu in Nigeria, right? That 5,000 grant that we receive when you are a Tony Elumelu fellowship and everything, that was the first money, free money in quotes, that we received as a startup coming from a Nigerian investors and philanthropists. And when you have such actions, it gives some lessons to our own government and investors to say, okay, you are here in your country, you have very brilliant startups, very good projects, and you are not doing anything for them to evolve. It's the neighbor and other countries that are doing more than you, that you are with the same country with the startups. So, but things are changing, and I really believe that if we put in place a startup act, but also very strong education programs on each step of the ecosystem, it can really help us to move forward.
Merci beaucoup. On peut applaudir Philippe. I go back to you about just what has been said. How can we orient financing tools on the continent to see the rise, the growing emergence of solid companies that can provide stable employment and not just a handful of success stories, but a real base of strong companies, not just a few success stories in African ecosystems such as Nigeria, but also in other African countries.
All right, thank you. Firstly, I would say that as entrepreneurs, we should ask ourselves, what am I solving for? It's a valid question because with the flurry of the attention, the media, at times it's easy to forget why you came to the marketplace in the first place, and then, it feels like it's showbiz. It isn't showbiz. So I think that for any, business owner, gender regardless, but value, valuable entrepreneur, if you are laser focused on what you're solving for, there are times that those problems are, at times when this is on my own personal story, when I look at what we're solving for, I tell myself, are you sure you're not doing a federal government work? Right? Are you sure you're not doing what the government should be doing? And that is because for so long, we've had a lot of, underbanked, excluded, women who are in labor, but then the funds, the monies, they are just operating at the same level or even going deeper. So as an entrepreneur, if you constantly ask yourself that question and you keep your eyes on the ball, like we say, value would definitely follow your mission. Value being helpful resources, value being capital, value being knowledge, value being the right social network itself. And where you have a fine blend of all of this, you are definitely, bound to be successful. Again, if you are solving rightly, your customer will keep coming back. Most of the time, we rarely talk about this, the customers or users, as we talk about in fintech, and everyone is fixated on the fundraising, is fixated on the fancy office, and all of that. So I'll just say that we should be much more retrospective and introspective, such that we have the right balance of who we are solving for and then what we are solving for. Away from that, I would say that, again, we should be more open, with each other. A founder's journey is very lonely. I say this. It takes, conversations like this where you meet co-founders, where you meet fellow entrepreneurs. You might be on different levels. Maybe some people had gone ahead of you. Some people are just coming up to realize that, hey, you guys are really having it hard. And then, when we start sharing stories, they'll be like, oh, Shalape, I thought you were having it easy. I say, who told you so? Right? Is it because, we all wear the burden differently. So by having, ecosystems like this, by having the right support groups, having the right conversations, having the right mentorship, I always say could be, forward mentorship or reverse mentorship. I'm a beneficiary of both, where I have younger people who, they mentor me. That happens, and it helps you, stay on top of trends. And then I would say that we should strengthen the woman. Again, we should strengthen the woman. There's nothing to be afraid of. If truly, because you cannot give what you do not have. And women are just naturally blessed with multitasking. So while a woman is chasing dreams, ambitions, trust me, she's putting structures and making the home too. In a case where you have children, if you do not have a strengthened woman, what is she passing on to those children? And then how then do we, nurture the next generation of entrepreneurs? Do you understand? So we just definitely have to get the right support system, get laser focused on the problem and the solution. Let's not, like I think it was the panel before ours that were talking about some sort of capital that it just rings you, right? But if you're getting capital and the capital is to expand that business, is to serve the person better, either through a combination of tech and touch. I always say everybody wants to, just go totally on technology these days. I am a great fan of technology. I'm the country director for Women in Tech Nigeria myself, compared to being founder of Harvest. But I always say that, there's a perfect balance between tech and touch itself, and we shouldn't lose that. So I'll just say that we should strengthen the woman, get the right support system, and of course, enable much focus on why we came out in the first place to solve. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Je vous demande d'applaudir son intervention qui est vraiment inspirante. Avant de revenir vers toi, Richard, I have, because you shared some your personal experience and point of view, but I have also a question for you, Eva. Regardless if you are based, it's really personal, regardless if you are based in Africa or in Europe, in Central Europe, you're based in Bulgaria, but your solution is having traction on the continent. According to you, as an entrepreneur, as a technologist, a founder as you are, what investors are looking for? And what objectives do you have to scale up your company in Europe, but also across the globe, in Africa? What is your personal vision about that?
Yes, it's a really good question, especially because now I'm actively fundraising. So I'm also going out, speaking to investors, trying to both portray what they want to see in terms of enormous growth, enormous scale, enormous potential, and also the reality of what I am building and the fact that I want it to be sustainable, I want it to be impactful. So I'm dealing with a specific breed of investors who are impact investors. And we already spoke about the importance of development actors, for example, in the startup and technology space. And for me, there's a lot of potential in transforming humanitarian and development aid into impact investing. I was actually at a conference in San Francisco recently called SOCAP, which is exactly about that. There was a lot of focus on Africa because a lot of development actors are focused on supporting different types of education, health, energy solutions. But when you frame it as development aid, you're not expecting it to generate a return on investment. So very frequently, it ends up becoming a sink and the money just disappears. You've invested it in something and maybe there's no return. But if you frame it as impact investing, then you're actually expecting both a return in terms of impact, but also in terms of revenue. So now I'm seeing a big trend there, and this is something that we're also very interested in tapping into because it embodies what we're looking for. We're not looking just for developing some useless technology that people can use, but that does not profoundly impact their lives. We're talking about specific industries like edtech, agriculture, clean energy that really require for everyone to cooperate and to work together and to come up with different solutions to address different aspects of these problems. And if we can make it in a sustainable way that actually generates revenue, is able to create more jobs, then it's going to be even better. So I'm not splitting them into different categories. For me, it's how do we make impact and generate profit? So we'll see. Investors are not very receptive yet. There are a lot of commitments. A lot of them say, yes, we're focusing on women. We're focusing on, vulnerable groups. But actually putting those commitments into practice is a whole other issue. Because as we mentioned, a lot of the people who are the decision makers have a completely different lived experience from the entrepreneurs who are solving those problems. So unless there are more women, for example, on venture capital boards, on investment committees, it will be much less likely that these solutions are going to get funded because it's a question of values, a question of perspective, a question of self-identification with the entrepreneur and with the business. So there needs to be also a lot of equality, not only amongst the entrepreneurs, but also among the investors.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup, Eva. On peut t'applaudir. Je reviens vers toi, Richard, pour te poser la même question que j'ai posée précédemment. C'est bien les success stories, c'est bien d'avoir 5, 6 ou 7 licornes, mais comment est-ce qu'on passe à la masse critique et on passe des exceptions, des success stories, mais d'une poignée de success stories, à un vrai écosystème d'entreprises solides avec une vraie croissance capable de faire un vrai passage à l'échelle? Quelles seraient selon toi les solutions? Et je poserai la même question ensuite à Philippe.
Thank you, Sami. So I think, if we want to have, on a nationwide basis, exactly, companies that are thriving, you need to look first at, I think, what works are knowledge-based societies. We need to look at talent, first of all. I think when it comes, for example, to the technology sector, you will see that you need to be able to bring up a critical level of talent that actually are, young people that are knowledgeable, that are trained, and that are capable to actually embrace careers in, in the IT sectors, in whatever sector you're aspiring to. We are familiar more or less with Endera, for example, that has been able to train young people. You have around 1.3 billion people in Africa. I think in some countries you have over 80% of the population that is considered to be young. One of the main success stories that is actually brought, Andela is just training 100,000 people. So you can see the gap between celebrating a success story that is has just trained 100,000 developers or more compared to the huge needs that exist. So I think we need to be able to have a mechanism that actually really, from the early age, you have a country like Kenya that recently introduced, I think, coding classes in the national curriculum. It's currently being implemented, but we need to look at the whole spectrum of education and see what kind of key interventions we can actually bring, from, early education. When we look, for example, at tertiary education, how can that be done in terms of, having, some of the best programs that exist, setting up, why not a free zone or an education zone, giving them the space, giving them some incentives, and say, hey, we have the ambition to maybe train 500,000 young people into IT careers that can become developers, data scientists, cybersecurity, that can be cybersecurity careers, and so on and so forth. So I think one important layer is really about talent. The second thing I think is that a lot of African countries actually rely on foreign capital. But like I mentioned, we have institutions locally now that are able to mobilize billions of dollars. We also have governments who also can buy, can actually offer, what can be thought as, in French, it's marché de l'innovation, but it's to give tenders to young companies, so that they have the opportunity to actually deploy some of their innovations. You need to have a courageous state that can look at, saying, similar maybe to some countries where you have small businesses that have maybe 20-30% of all tenders reserved for them. We can look at mechanisms where we say, we're going specifically for startups or for innovative companies, maybe set aside 5% or 10%, or whatever public markets the state is actually having annually, and dedicate it to those actors. So I think that's something that is also interesting in terms of looking at it. At the end of the day, you really need a combination of all those stakeholders, and I've seen from my perspective that a lot of startup or a lot of young companies or entrepreneurs actually have a mindset where they always want to go at it alone. But you really need to think ecosystem perspective. And to me, what better actors, than the state, than the government? We shy on them, but we shouldn't be. I mean, we've seen transformation when we have, when we have visionary leadership. We've seen countries like Rwanda that's making leaps and bounds. We can criticize whatever record we want to criticize, but we've seen them moving, leaps and bounds. If we have visionary leadership, public officials that understand what entrepreneurship can and should be and how transformative it could be for the economies, we can roll out different plans and mechanisms and actually carry national champions that, first of all, predominate the market, to dominate the national markets, and then think afterwards in terms of, how can they can expand themselves afterwards. So I think those could be some of the suggestions that I would like to make.
Merci beaucoup. Merci Richard. Je vais te poser la même question et après, on va faire pour chacun d'entre vous un mot de la fin, de conclusion. Mais pareil, comment est-ce qu'on sort des success stories, de la poignée de success stories, avec quelque chose de beaucoup plus mainstream dans l'écosystème?
Okay. As Richard said, we really need to have like a plan to build our national champions, right? You need to teach to entrepreneurs what is to have the African mindset of success. We need to also, for those who already succeed, to give feedback of what they have been through, and to tell to the others, so, okay, this is the path. It will not be easy, it will be very difficult, but this is the path. I think that we need to demystify success in Africa. Because, you know, we are all Africans, right? We also have the African cultures. Some entrepreneurs will say, oh, Andela guys or Flutterwave, or maybe because they are Nigerians, or maybe because they are Kenyan, maybe they are because they are Egyptians, right? It can be partially true, but all those guys have put in the hard work. All those guys have some strategies that they have put in place to be where they are. And I think that that's something that we need to give back to the community also, for us to understand what is the path to reach those success. That's the first step. Also, as Richard said, the ecosystem is very important. It's very, very important because you can build national champion with a very weak ecosystem. It's not possible. We need to strengthen every link of the ecosystem for us to grow together and have every step of the process being fulfilled. And I will keep saying education. Sorry, but I really believe that it's something that we need to prioritize and put in the center of our development process. I will take an example in Cameroon. In Cameroon, in the early 70s, so after the independence of the country, we had at that time a president, Aijo. And he saw that we had a problem, because to develop the country, we need to have local and national champions, because we had a lot of foreign companies that were doing business in the country, and he wasn't seeing how it's benefiting the local population with all those business doing. So what they did is that as the government is doing now for the incentive or the startup act for the tech companies, at that time, they try to identify per region different local champions and try to see how they can nurture them, and to give, as Richard said, some tenders, and to give some exoneration on taxes, to give many incentives for them to have to have the tools for them to grow faster, and but also to have a ecosystem that they can build with the different champions. And I think that once we have all those different links strengthened, we can have local champions, then national champions, and then regional champions. And if we have a lot of cooperation between different countries, maybe in Central Africa, it will be easier for the different startups to collaborate and to penetrate different countries with those different elements. Yeah.
Merci beaucoup. Merci. Merci. Bah, tu vas garder le micro, non? Parce qu'on va faire un tour de table, parce qu'il nous reste que 10 minutes. Et vous avez, you will all have 2 minutes to conclude each. So my question is, are you optimistic about the fact that the level of deals of African startups fundraising in Africa will be as high or va dépasser le niveau de 2021-2022? Et what major trends should we expect, according to you, in the coming years?
I'm highly optimistic, very highly optimistic, because you know we have the demographic, right? we have the geographic, and we have what I usually call the African mindset, right? And you see that for the first quarter, the startups raised more than what they raised in the first semester last year. And I really believe that if ecosystems are put in place, if the EdTech is more put in the center of what we can do to empower the youth, if women entrepreneurship can be also put in place, I really believe that things can grow further, not only in tech, but all the other sectors in Africa. Yeah.
Merci beaucoup. Merci. Eva, same question.
Yes, I'm actually pessimistic. Just because we are entering a global recession, and of course the worst affected are going to be those who do not have a lot of capital amassed and prepared. So it's going to be rough, and I'm also preparing for this. So I don't want to be too optimistic. We really need to think of how to amass enough capital and how to enable streams of capital to entrepreneurs. Because whenever there is a recession, of course, the small companies, small businesses, startups are going to be the worst affected, and none of the governments is going to be able to even think about tenders and so on. So I really think that there needs to be a lot of measures that have to be taken before the recession gets worse in order to make sure that these startups do not only survive, but they thrive in the crisis.
Merci beaucoup. Merci, Eva. Richard?
Well, I think I'm having an optimistic outlook, rather. I mean, the recession is not yet proven. And you've seen that when you look at venture capital investment, you're seeing that actually there's a slight rebound. And I think it's going to be hard to, how startups are going to weather this period. But I'm definitely optimistic about the African startup being able to fundraise. In terms of trends, I'm seeing three things. Fintech is a sector that is increasingly overcrowded. So you're going to see investor appetite for other sectors. It's already happening, like clean tech, like health tech, like agri-tech. I'm also seeing the rise of, the need to actually bring together local investors blended with foreign capital. So you're already seeing that in some countries. You have the rise of angel networks, which is the first thing, but you're going to see more and more local capital interested when they're going to see success stories emerging. You had that huge interest of Nigerian, for example, local investors after Paystack acquisition. So I expect that to come forward. And then the last thing, I expect new countries to become emerging startup nations beyond the big four, such as Ethiopia, which is going to definitely rise in the next years.
Merci. Merci beaucoup.
Yeah, okay, no, thank you. I'm quite optimistic, very, very optimistic. And I think the trend of seeing a lot of investment into the ecosystem will continue. What I'm also seeing is what Eva spoke about, impact investing. And that is coming both from the private sector and the development sector. So that will continue designing solutions, innovative financing solutions, vehicles that can target people differently, women, young startups, and more established startups. So I see the trend, growing and quite significantly. And being that, what we are also seeing and what I think will continue is private people, private capital coming out of Africa, high network individuals, angel investors investing, because what we have had so far is outside capital that do not have the same needs for, they focus more on return on investment, not on impact. But we have high network individuals across Africa who are looking and who have already started investing into funds. What we are also seeing is allocators coming from women. Currently, myself, I'm in the process of, we are trying to set up a fund, to get together female funders, because the more you have women being fund allocators, the better chances of women entrepreneurs being funded. So that is also a trend that will grow. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sholape.
Yes, absolutely. I've never been much more optimistic than now. Some dynamics will change, but in terms of growth of new ventures, scaling of existing ventures, it would definitely go up. However, some things that would change might include in terms of valuation, a lot more questions asked, especially as it matters to revenue. A great reduction in vanity metrics, as we call it, right? We've had 20,000 sign-ups, we've had 100,000 sign-ups. How has that gone, translated to revenue? What's the lifetime value of your users? Someone mentioned this morning, some people are using $200 to acquire a user that you'd probably have to keep with you for 5 years, and you do not have, So a lot of things will change. However, as Irene mentioned, it would have much more of local domestic players who have their hearts and mind, backing the funding. And that is the kind of capital that we need. That is the best capital, if you ask me. You understand the challenges, you are putting your funds where your mouth is, and then you are patient enough to grow, with me, rather than someone who doesn't understand. I even have to deal with internet in some cases, or bad road network, or poor internet network. So you understand the challenges, and you're able to work with me, and together we can grow the Africa we'd all be proud of.
Proud of. Voilà, c'est le mot de la fin. Thank you very much. Je vous demande d'applaudir nos panélistes. Sholape Akinpelu, la fondatrice d'Hervé, je vous demande de l'applaudir, qui vient de conclure ce panel. Je vous demande d'applaudir également Irène pour son intervention et pour sa participation à ce panel. Richard Séchier, qui bien entendu nous a partagé ses insights sur la FinTech. Merci à toi et bravo. Iva Gudmishka, la fondatrice de Humans in the Loop. Bravo à elle. Et enfin, alors c'est maintenant que ma tablette s'éteint, Philippe, qui nous vient de Douala avec sa structure et qui nous a beaucoup éclairé sur l'écosystème camerounais et sur la question du Startup Act. Merci à toi. Merci à ce panel. Bravo à tous. Et on me fait signe qu'on a dépassé. Donc je rends l'antenne. Merci à vous et à très bientôt. Bon, je suis désolé parce que...